Hello, hello. How are you?
I'm well. How are you?
Very good. Super excited to sit down and have this conversation with you. I've had the pleasure to partner with you specifically for many events in our tenure, but uh, people out there might not know who you are. So say a little bit about Regina to get us going.
Well, hard to believe if they don't know who I am. But with that, I've been in the meetings and events industry for, geez, over 30 years.
Short
I
version.
started,
Time is relative.
time is relative, right? So if you don't know me, I'm not sure why not. No, but over 30 years, I worked for an off-premise catering company early on in my career for several years. And then I transferred over to the hotel side of things and got some background working in the hotel world. And then I went to a corporation and worked in their meeting planning department for 20 years about and started at a low level and worked my way up in the planning department. And while there, planned events, and this was for a fast food company, planned events that ranged from 100-person senior leadership meeting to events that were 16,000 people, conventions. And within those roles, I did anything from registration to housing to food and beverage to logistics to ancillary meetings, exhibits. So within that role or my time at that company, I really got a well-rounded background on all functions,
Yeah.
meeting and convention planning related.
And then a few years back, the shift went into kind of independent work. And you and I have
Yes.
crossed paths with a lot of like food and beverage specific events where you either were supporting food and beverage or you were the lead for food and beverage specifically. Um, where our conversation is going, and I've just so loved just having the wealth of knowledge from comparing a bit of like the journey that some of these topics that we're approaching in these conversations have gone over the years. Because especially with dietary concerns, to me, the conversation or the qualifications have not been a gradual incline. It kind of went from this to all of a sudden spiking into uh, uh, 6 years ago, would you say? Like everyone had something that they were trying to watch or had a concern about or things like that. Uh, do you have that same sentiment a bit of like how dietary has evolved?
Absolutely. And you're right. I became independent about 8 years ago. And starting that, the majority, not all of my work, but a lot of my work is managing food and beverage for large conventions, anywhere from 5,000 people on up. And yes, definitely have noticed a shift, like you said, maybe 6, 7 years ago, not even quite when I started, but that allergies are becoming more and more prevalent. And the question also is, when is it an allergy and when is it a preference, right? But in the whole scheme of things, it really doesn't matter,
Yep.
right? We have to cater to what the attendees are asking for. And I mean, certainly if it is an allergy, it's an extreme concern, right? And we have to address that. But yes, just about 6 or 7 years ago, it really did escalate and beyond just vegetarian and vegan is very prevalent right now. The most common allergy in a sense though is gluten free,
Gluten free.
right? And how do we accommodate those gluten free and nut allergies now and dairy allergies? And so it's yes, it's quite quite a task now creating menus to incorporate all of these different, taking everything into account?
My mind immediately goes back, and I now am dating myself to that scene of like my big fat Greek wedding where the uh, significant other is a vegetarian and the uh, grandmother is, but it's lamb and it's lamb. Do you know that scene? Like,
Right.
but that was kind of the world we used to live in, where it was there wasn't as much catering to the individual attendee experience as I feel like there is now. So like back prior to this shift, like describe a typical event. We would have our standard attendee meals, and then there would be vegetarian special meals, or like what did it look like before we had so many varieties of different dietary?
I think there would be, just your regular menu. And at the time, especially, like 8 years ago, there's also been a shift in how people eat, right?
Sure.
And so 8 years ago, when I really started focusing on um, this element, this function within large shows, uh, for lunch, there would be just a huge lunch buffet, right? With your salads and your multiple entrees and just a big, long, hot buffet. So there would be a lot of options. And beyond that, we might ask people, even though at that time there were halal and kosher meals,
Sure.
right? That
Yep.
that people were still asking for. So we would accommodate that. But the dietary, because there was so many offerings on those hot buffets, it seemed like it wasn't as prevalent. But definitely there has been a shift. And allergies are more common than ever now than they were even 6, 8 years ago. And especially in the Western world, right? In our world, it's not as prevalent over in Europe. I don't think planning some events over in Europe as well. Their allergy concerns aren't as prevalent as what they are in the US, which is interesting.
And at the end of the day, we are talking about sending people to the hospital nowadays more than we ever have before, right? Like we are going to have a severe allergic reaction in which the EMT needs to come in and immediately administer an EpiPen, in order for this person, or we're taking them out of 2 days of programming because the prolonged effects of eating the thing has more than just a 24-hour turnaround, right? Like,
Right, exactly. And it's kind of this has become I've become even a little bit more passionate about it in the last couple of years because there was an incident, a personal incident where somebody we know was extremely affected going to a restaurant, which did unfortunately result in a death. So knowing that, and just because the restaurant didn't take precautions, and that this can be a life or death situation
yeah.
for our attendees. And we really need to do the best to accommodate their needs. Preference again aside, it doesn't matter. This is how people are eating now. And we really need to accommodate them.
Yep. And I think a piece of that starts from the education standpoint. And I'm curious to know a little bit more of like, it feels like there's still kind of a chef disconnect of understanding the allergens to the level that we need to curate for on the planning side. Do you agree or see that statement a little bit differently?
No, I do. I mean, just having worked with a hotel recently for a large show, there's 8 common allergens, right? When you take into account dairy and eggs and nuts. Well, one of our attendees had a certain allergen that really affected her,
Yep.
right? But it wasn't included in that eight.
Yeah.
So it's like they don't label it. So there's there's definitely, I mean, they don't label it on the menu card, right? And so I think there's definitely a lot more work that can be done in the industry for sure, to correct that. So
Well, and we're looking at staff and crew meals that are accommodating maybe vegan as an option, but aren't necessarily accommodating gluten-free or dairy-free or egg-free. So really from like the planner's perspective, are you finding yourself like needing to comb through the staff and crew menus to the same granularity as the attendee menus to make sure we are accommodating for everyone when we show up on site?
you do really need to do that. And one of the key things is absolutely working with the hotel, but beyond your catering manager as well. I think it's important now more than ever to engage the culinary team, like the executive chef, the banquet chef, maybe in particular. And we all manage a budget, right? And we try to watch our budget. And those staff menus are designed to be a little bit more affordable. However, with affordability comes lack of options, right? And so then it just, if you don't delve into those menus just like you do attendee menus, then it becomes an issue on site, and then it's an reaction. And so yes, you are absolutely right, where we do need to give those staff menus the same kind of um, review and planning as we do the attendee menus, because
Yeah,
in the end they're attendees as well, right? And we
exactly.
need to feed them, and the same outcome could happen if not taken into account.
Oftentimes, more than just the 3 days that the attendees are there, oftentimes we're, feeding the staff and crew for 7 days. And if someone is going to have issues with their meal, breakfast and lunch for 7 days, like chances are someone is going to hear about it, right? Like,
Yes, you are absolutely correct.
you
And
brought up something. Yeah, go
and
ahead.
again, sometimes those can be client people as well,
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
Which leads me, if you don't mind, into a topic of, the attendee engagement and really capturing what their needs are. But when we talk about attendee engagement in the registration site and, listing if what will be included in the regular attendee menus, I think we also need to take that to the next level and do that on the staff side too,
yeah.
right? Because staff staff and crew don't register the same way attendees do, sometimes don't register at all. Sometimes we just make hotel reservations for them. So we don't have their dietary needs. And we really need to start, because on some shows, you could have a staff and crew as hundreds of people.
Yep.
And so we really need to start thinking that way too, to accommodate our staff who are working long hours, right? And don't have the ability to go out and get their own food if they do have certain preferences or allergies. So we really need to delve further into that too, on how to capture their needs and accommodate those.
Yep. Let's break down that registration process a little bit in that general attendee experience from the registration perspective is how can I accomplish this conference registration with as least amount of friction as possible, right? So we almost have these combative forces coming against each other, where from the food and beverage perspective, we want more detail than what a checkbox is going to give us. And what is not useful for us is the fill in the blank option of other, right? Because when we are talking about 16,000 people writing in a fill in the blank, that turns into a full day project to decipher what boxes and what things need to be accommodated for. So yes, there is this level of efficiency that we want to engineer for the registration process to make it frictionless. But I would argue, and I would love to hear your thoughts on this, of like when it comes to dietary, if you are checking a box that says, yes, I have dietary accommodations that are needed, it brings up kind of a secondary module that is a little bit more than just checking the box on vegan, gluten-free, dairy-free, nut-free, halal or kosher. Um, any thoughts on like that concept in general?
Yes, I that is one point also is to first of all engage with the registration team,
Sure.
right? Because it depends show to show on when you as a food and beverage manager are being engaged. And sometimes it can be after registration opens.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, and that ship has already sailed then as it relates to what is included from a dietary preference and what isn't. So, I always like to, engage the registration team early and see what verbiage is being considered for the site. Um, I do like to, again, in today's day and age, I think we have to accommodate vegetarian, nut-free, vegan, no fish, no seafood, no shellfish, all of those types of things. Um, and I personally like to include a statement on the registration site under dietary that does say menus are designed to take into account all of these different allergens and preferences. And then beyond that, what does need to be provided for is the halal and the kosher and a few, maybe a celiac as well.
Mhm.
So I like to really try to keep those check boxes limited, um, to avoid exactly what you were talking about earlier, that other category. And I don't like cilantro,
Right.
things like that. So, and then, beyond that, to then contact the reg team or contact the help center if there's something specific. One thing that I always say is that we as food and beverage managers are there to work even one-on-one with an individual attendee, in a show of 16,000 people on how we can help them eat, right,
Yeah.
when they're traveling. Because it is a medical issue in a lot of cases. And so we want them to be able to enjoy the show that they're attending and learn the content and be able to be nourished as well.
Yep. And there's a time factor in that as well, right? So I'm going to come at this with twofold. If I register for a conference 6 months ago, or sometimes my admin registered me for the conference 6 months ago, and they know my dietary preference, I may not know that my accommodation is being or my request is being accommodated for, right? So we've started to do this kind of leading up to show site of like sending out that reconfirmation for some of our more severe dietary. Can you talk a little bit about like where that came from and how that is a useful tool to kind of right size our numbers when it comes into us actually ordering these meals?
Yeah, that communication is key for sure. And that did evolve from waste, right?
Yeah.
Because we would have people check a box saying they needed this meal, needed that meal. And some of those meals are special order meals that are required from outside of the hotel that were charged more than the regular attendee meal. So, and then when you don't have the people pick it up, right, then there is a lot of waste, hits your budget no matter what. And none of us want to be wasteful, especially when it comes to food, right? So we have started, and this has been for several years now, following up with those individual attendees and over email, saying this is, you requested this. Are you going to use this? Are you going to pick up this meal? Sometimes we've even gotten granular to these meals, I'll just use kosher as an example, will be provided for breakfast and lunch these 3 days. Do you plan on um, eating and picking up these meals these 3 days, right? So we'll do that. But then also, in addition to that, we'll communicate with all those people who requested it, but then we'll say it's on a first come, first serve basis
Yep.
and order that way so we don't, because you were never ever, even when people communicate back and say they want them, you will never have 100% pickup.
Yep.
So it's how to avoid it, how to manage your budget, how to stay on track with that, and how to not be wasteful. So we do say they're available on a first come first serve basis, and do it that way, and then keep track year over year if you need to increase what your pickup percentage was, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah. And that data tracking piece of it, I think is super important to know that we had 100 kosher meals left over, right? We way over ordered one day, but those are learnings for next year. Like the other thing that I think is worth noting is that once the plan is in place, like the pickup can't change from one day to another. Those meals are ordered, they're made, they're coming from an outside vendor. It's not necessarily something that if we had 50 left over today, we can do 50 less tomorrow, right?
Right. Exactly.
Um,
Hmm.
so,
Yeah.
so making sure, and let's get into that process of what this has been done a few different ways. The term that I love that I think it was the Aria in Las Vegas uses instead of a special meals sign, they have a culinary concierge, is what they call it. And so that's a term that a few of the other programs that I've done have adopted. But walk me through like what the typical attendee experience is to go pick up their meal from quote unquote special meals.
And that's a good point. We actually have been getting away from that terminology, special meals, because special meals to somebody could be, well, I'm vegan, and sometimes vegan isn't accommodated. And so special meals. So that's where I go, right? So
Yeah.
we have gotten that away from that terminology. And I haven't heard the culinary concierge. I do like that. Um, but a lot of the term we use on signage most recently is pre-ordered, right? Pre-ordered meals. So specifically if you were communicated with as an attendee on a pre-ordered meal, and so we do communicate with them and tell them where once on site, right, where to go within that main kind of attendee food meal hall. And so there is signage that we set up, but it's a separate distribution area in a corner, whatever, with signage, with staffing, and with the culinary team as well, who will assist with serving the specific item that that person has ordered. So it's kind of a check-in procedure, right? When you get there, we check off a name, and then the culinary team will serve the actual meal.
And having manned one of those pre-ordered meal tables before, like it's kind of a skill to develop, right? You aren't just handing over a meal. You're kind of there expected to have the answers of what is being served, how it was prepared. Am I assured that my allergen has been accommodated for? And if not, like, is there something for me to eat here? And we're talking about kind of that late morning, early afternoon hanger may have set in, and there is a level of intensity that sometimes can revolve around that table. Like you mentioned it, but having that chef on hand, do you think is a helpful step?
It's absolutely key. And whether you're dealing with a small amount of pre-ordered meals or a lot, if you have a 20,000 person show, your pre-ordered meals section um, can be a mini kitchen in itself, right? And I have been on those shows as well, and in those distribution points. But you are absolutely correct. You are expected to know, as that front attendee facing person, what is being served, what the options are. So yeah, you need to be educated, and it's that pre-ordered area is not for the faint of heart. Let's just say,
Yeah.
as you well know.
Yep. And but super important that there is that level of accommodation. So it's not all doom and gloom
Absolutely.
over there. There is a lot of appreciation that comes through as well, of like the call out, of receiving the email, of knowing where to go, of having the reassurance that they don't need to bring an extra carry-on full of all of their snacks and food to eat for the week, because we did prepare something for them. So there is a level of appreciation that goes into that table as well, on site.
It is, yeah, absolutely. And it's another element of the food and beverage planning that you have to prepare for, that you have to, communicate with the attendee. If it's a well-functioning process, they are absolutely very appreciative,
Yeah.
always.
As
And
it
and do convey that to you as well, which I'm sure you have been on the receiving end of that.
Yes, whether it's good or bad, I've been on the receiving end of both.
Yes, both ways.
But one of the tricky things that I think is worth highlighting in that is that oftentimes, from the planner's perspective, you don't necessarily know what the kosher and halal meal will be, because it is coming from an outside vendor, right? So there is a level of needing to investigate kind of in the moment when the property has received those meals from the other vendor. Like, any thoughts on how we can be better at getting those menus solidified, written up, like a little bit more prep that goes into anything that is hitting those pre-ordered meals categories?
Yes, I definitely suggest doing your due diligence, and not that it's an afterthought, right? Because it is just as important. And some large hotels do have on their menus, on their printed menus, kosher pricing, halal pricing. They won't actually say what is in those menus, right?
Yeah.
Because as you mentioned as well, they're usually from an outside source. But you still need to do the due diligence with what is being provided, because again, those menus typically are more than what your general hotel attending menu costs. And I have on occasion received, that morning, right? Not knowing what was going to be served, but you look in the box and it's like, oh my gosh, this is supposed to be $125
Mm,
lunch menu,
sure. Yep.
and so I think you do need to do the due diligence and get with the hotel. They are able to find out from the vendor what will be included in that lunch or in that breakfast, and to make sure it is worth the value of what you're being charged for it. And, to even take it a step further and maybe include that on signage at the pre-ordered meals table, so people know what they're getting besides just looking in a box. So,
A perfect segue, when you brought up signage is hard, right? Like, um, the
as we know,
the flexibility of yesteryear for the culinary team to make a menu change kind of on the fly is basically out the window. Would you agree?
absolutely, absolutely.
And it used to be that, like, if we didn't receive our shipment of this, like, the culinary team had the ability to make us swap. And I'm sure it's still written into to some contracts that, like, that is something that the property can do. But there is a detrimental trickle down for every sort of menu change that happens without communication. Can you speak to a little bit of, like, what your experience looks like in that?
Yes, I mean, they're watching their bottom line more than ever now. And some, they don't stock all of these things. Even a large convention hotel, they just can't react to a change like that because they're not keeping that kind of inventory. And a lot of times, a lot of their products too are not made in-house. Somebody told me some crazy percentage for a hotel that the majority of their menus were made outside of the hotel, and I'm like, that just seemed impossible to me for a large convention hotel. But I mean, that's a good segue into my next point, which is your menu development and communication with the hotel,
Yeah.
right? It goes beyond your catering manager. It's very frustrating in today's day and age that these huge convention hotels do not have on their menus the dietary designation, right? That this is a gluten-free item, this contains nuts, or anything like that on their menus. And so it's hard to do menu development trying to incorporate what we just said we would be doing on the registration site,
Yeah.
right? Vegan, vegetarian, no nuts, things like that. Cheese on this, cheese on the side for salads, all of those types of things. I think it's important to, when doing your menu development, and of course this goes to the staff menus as well, as we mentioned earlier, is to sit with the culinary team and from the get-go, from that first site visit, and set your expectations. And if it's going to cost more, it's going to cost more, but that from the get-go.
Sure.
And then to
Sure.
your point, you don't have these issues on site, whether it's an attendee or a staff person, and create the menus so they are all inclusive. Now, if it's modifying an existing menu, right? So then it's a modification, and then the chef is on that from the get-go, from the onset, that we are making a modification to this menu. This comes a lot with soy, right?
Yeah.
When you're incorporating soy into menus, and well, there's those allergens, and so my other it then do take that through the planning process, right? So then you have modified menus created. And another good thing to add, I'll just side note, is if you have the budget and you have these all and you have all of these different food allergies, preferences, sometimes incorporating a small little salad buffet
Yeah.
with protein on the side, and make your own salad, proteins on the side. That's all people need sometimes at lunch, right? I said, when I first started in this consulting industry, we were doing hot buffets still, and that has changed. People's eating preferences have changed. Nobody eats like that at lunch anymore, so you need to accommodate a lot of different varieties of tastes and allergies and preferences. But what I'm talking about, carrying it through, I think BEOs, when you get the BEOs back from the catering manager, and even though it will say modified on there, right, to have this on the side, or this item is supposed to not include that but include this. I think it's important to, when we all do our BEO reviews on site, to have the culinary team there, the banquet chef there, to be calling out those things specifically, because back of house in the kitchen, they get in there, they are just zooming right along and making all these things for 10,000 people, and they don't see those things.
Yep.
And when they don't see those things, that that change that affects the signage, right? That we've put out, that affects the attendee allergen that we said we were going to accommodate. So I think it's really important to, more than now than ever, because I've been in these situations and you have as well, to engage that culinary team beyond your catering manager from beginning to end. Um, it also amazes me that they, as the hotel industry culinary team, aren't really more focused on this, right?
Yeah.
And trying to improve the process as an industry, because this is such a huge liability. It can become a huge liability.
Yep. And I know there are some properties out there that are really leaning into the gluten-free aspect of trying to make the majority of their menu items outside of bread and rolls and things like that made without gluten. So they're swapping tamari instead of soy sauce. Like they're
Right.
making some of those that aren't impacting flavor. The nice thing about the world we live in, in a chat GPT world is like we have the resources to quickly go through this and make some alternative recommendations to partner with your culinary team. So it's not as big of a lift as it once was to review all of your attendee meals and all of your staff and crew meals. But you're absolutely right. We are still getting BEOs back that don't have dietary listed on them, right? And if
Mhm.
that is the understood behind the scenes by way of a spreadsheet that is managed outside of the printed menus and things like that, it's still an extra step of putting the trust in the property that you're executing in, that they are following through, that oops, just because we were out of this barbecue sauce that is gluten free, we didn't swap it for this barbecue sauce that does contain gluten.
Right.
And that it's there reinforced on your paperwork as well, so that your banquets team knows about it and is looking for it, that your menu card signages are accurate, which oftentimes the BEO is dictating what goes on those menu cards, right? So to your point of starting it early, I think there's a huge opportunity to try as the planner to get your catering manager and your property to put dietary on your BEOs, to ensure that you are doing a draft review of your printed menu signage before you get on site, so that you can cross check that the things that are supposed to have dietary on it are listed as such. And those are the little pre work things that prevent a lot of headaches and conversations on site. Would you agree?
Exactly. And that the dietary signage was going to be, I think, my final point that that's a pain point of mine.
Yep.
Absolutely. And, I think hotels have gotten better, but even just within the last couple of years, those were an afterthought, right? It was like the last thing going out, they'd make sure that everything had serving utensils and all of that. But those dietary signs, oh my gosh, I have,
Yeah.
the banquet captain had to go print them. So I think hotels have gotten better with that, but there still needs to be a lot of improvement on the designations that go along with those menu items. And to your earlier point, if you do the pre-work, if you do it in advance, you have the ability to ask for those signs from the hotel, to review them before getting on site, to tweak, just to make sure to avoid those problems on site for sure. But it still goes back to engaging the culinary team, the banquets team, and have them be part of your whole planning, really from beginning to end, on-site execution. So it's drilled into their brain. Yes, that barbecue sauce is supposed to be the gluten-free one. No, we cannot substitute. And so you avoid a lot of those headaches on site then.
Yeah, and I think uh, that it's not going away, right? It's kind of only going to become more accommodating. We live in this world where the expectation is becoming restaurant level service at large 16,000 person events, where I have the ability to find something that I have the taste for almost. And I think for those large functions, we found a lot of success in kind of the either compartmentalizing little dishes, so that someone does have the ability to choose a sandwich that might be, or a gluten-free wrap over here, right? And then a bowl over here, or kind of a build your own concept, depending on your guest threshold, and how many people we have to move through. But like, what are some other things that come to mind for just the masses that hit more dietary, and beyond dietary, more preference requests that we're seeing a lot more commonly these days?
Yeah, variety is definitely, key. And smaller portions, really.
Sure.
Again, I've for what I've planned have gotten away from those full-on lunch buffets with salads and hot entrees and starches and desserts, right? And so offerings in general are a little bit smaller, but you can do a hot bowl or a cold bowl or a soup or a small side salad or even, individual portions of um, vegetables or things like that, that it's more just of a grab and go. It's something you could eat standing up because a lot of companies are getting away from, the sea of tables, right?
Yeah.
They don't like the sea of dining tables. And with the learning agendas the way they are now, sometimes attendees only have 30 minutes to eat. So if it's more of a grab and go almost, that you could eat it sitting down, but you could eat it standing up too. And variety of items, whether hot or cold. The hotel can execute a hot grab and go item very well, without sacrificing the temperature. Um, but it gives people a variety to choose from, especially when you're having a show over 3 days, right?
And if there's pushback from the property of doing that concept for lunch, I like to reinforce that they do the same thing for receptions. Like it's not a concept that isn't achievable by a property. It's basically repurposing their reception menu into a lunch menu and doing that style service. I think a lot of the times when people are thinking I'm lunch for 10,000 people, their mind immediately goes to that traditional buffet because that's how it's been done forever.
Right,
So it's
right.
it's also our role as from the planner's perspective to reinforce some of these learnings and kind of see some of these things through, because in essence we are creating a better attendee experience for people with or without dietary concerns, right?
Right, right. And to that point, just even maybe 5 years ago, maybe this was pre-pandemic, but I did a show, and this is where it just really became enlightening. I did a large show. It was about 12,000 people, and the food area was adjacent to the exhibit area. And so we did a traditional hot buffet at that time, again, just like 5, 6 years ago, traditional hot buffet for the attendees. But then we had done some grab and go on the exhibit floor because the exhibitors can't always leave, right? And even if they go do in shifts. So we did some grab and go on the exhibit floor, which was mainly meant for the exhibitors. Well, the data that came back from that, the grab and go was wiped out because there were attendees on the floor, of course, as well. And the percentage, of actual the guarantee was much lower than expected on the hot buffet. And that's where, the thinking was, this isn't how people are eating anymore.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so you need to offer them the variety, smaller portions, easy to eat, right? And offering variety like that too, I think can really take into account your dietary preferences and allergies and help with menu development.
Perfect. Well, always a joy and a pleasure to speak with you. And I think a very uh, future thinking, forward thinking conversation, because as we've explored over this past half an hour, it's like it hasn't been perfected yet. There are things in our industry that have achieved a level of understanding across the board. And dietary is one of those where I personally feel like it is still on its path to cracking the code. And every year we get a little bit better, but there's still a lot of learning to be done, right?
I agree. I agree. I think yes, both on the planner side and the hotel side. And I think the main point is really trying to take into the account what the attendee wants. Again, whether preference or allergy, they're our clients, right? They're the ones we are catering to. And whether we're communicating in the masses or communicating individually with that person, we need to do as much as possible in our power to accommodate their needs.
Awesome. Great way to close. I appreciate you. Thank you so
Wonderful.
much.
Wonderful to see you. Thank you.